Hello, class. Welcome to this chapter 3 lecture video. You noticed on your syllabus, like in the reading material and stuff for this chapter, we are not doing this full chapter. This outline is actually really short. The slides are pretty short as well. And we really need to talk a little bit about cost behavior, which is what chapter 3 is about. And then it gets near the end and starts talking about some mixed costs and some estimation methods and stuff like that. And just for the sake of time and the scope of this class, I think it's a little beyond the scope. So we're going to leave the second part of chapter 3 out of this, okay? We're going to identify what mixed and step costs are. But then when we get done with that, we're not going to do any of those estimation methods. We're just going to call it right there and then move on to chapter 4. All right, so let me get my slideshow going here. Screen shared. All right, I'm following the chapter 3 outline. We're going to talk about cost behavior and forecasting. Okay. Cost behavior it's going to be essential, not so much of what we're doing moving forward in the rest of this chapter, but when we get into the next couple units, we're going to deal more with these costs. And the major ones we're going to be concerned about are variable and fixed costs. Okay. And a variable cost is a cost that does not change as total output changes. Okay. Whereas variable cost increases with total with an increase in output and decreases. So it has that direct relationship with total production. And here we're talking about total cost. And knowing how these costs change and stuff like that, it's essential to our planning, controlling, and decision-making, everything we're doing in managerial accounting. Okay, especially when we start talking about estimating costs, what's our variable cost going to be? We know what our fixed costs are going to be. Okay. So how many do we need to sell, in order to make this amount of profit, stuff like that. Everything we're talking about here when it comes to fixed costs has to deal with the relevant range. Okay, so fixed costs are only good within that relevant range, meaning if we had machines, because depreciation expense is going to be part of our fixed costs, is what we're going to know, right? And so we have our machinery and we have a factory, and we know the maximum we can produce is 20,000 units. Okay, if we wanted to produce 30,000 units, we might have to go out and buy a new piece of equipment and maybe add on to our factory and add a little more floor space. Okay, those would increase our fixed costs. Okay, but that's because it's outside of our relevant range. That's what relevant range means there, is that our fixed costs are going to be good within the side of this relevant range as long as we don't go above our production level. Okay, so just kind of a little bit more in-depth look here at fixed costs and how fixed costs behave. Fixed costs are total. Their total is a constant number, okay, within that relevant range. So if our fixed costs are 100,000 this month, they're going to be 100,000 next month. They're going to be 100,000 the following month, okay? What is also kind of unique about this is I want you to be able to explain it from a different point of view also, is that on a per unit level. Okay, as the slide indicates here, it has an inverse relationship to production on a per unit level. So here the total cost is 32,000. That is a fixed cost. It stays 32,000. No matter what we produce, we're going to have a cost of 32,000. As you can see though, the per unit cost, the more we produce, the lower the per unit cost comes in. This is where you can kind of create those economies of scale. Once you have all your fixed costs set into place and you start ramping up production, your unit costs go down. It allows you to sell lower than your competition. Okay, that just kind of explains it more. Discretionary versus committed costs. These are just good terms to know. Discretionary means it's up to the choice of the management. They may or may not have it. Okay, company picnics, bonuses, stuff like that. Those are discretionary fixed costs. Committed fixed costs are fixed costs, though, that cannot be avoided no matter what. They are essential, such as maybe your building rent or your building mortgage. And here they're using advertising as discretionary fixed costs, yes, because you're gonna have a fixed cost budget for advertising. Management's going to decide how much it's going to be, and there you go, your lease, long-term contract, you need it. Variable costs. They behave in the exact opposite way as fixed costs. Okay, so their total costs are going to vary in direct proportion to what sales do or what production does. Okay, the more we produce, the higher the cost. The less we produce, the lower the cost. Okay. I thought I had a slide for it, but I don't. But on a per unit level, you remember how our fixed cost on a per unit level, they changed. Variable cost on a per unit level will always be the same. Think of our major variable costs are our direct materials, direct labor. Okay, so the more we produce, the more total variable costs we're going to have for direct labor or direct material, because the more material we're going to use. Okay, but for every unit we produce, it's still going to cost the same amount. Total cost fluctuates, but the per unit stays the same. Whereas in fixed costs, the total stayed the same and the per unit cost fluctuates. Mixed costs kind of are exactly what they say. They have a fixed and a variable component. Okay, choosing it here with a fixed supervisor salary plus the cost of supplies. Okay. Another one you can think of is maybe your sales commissions. Okay. Maybe you or your salespeople, maybe you pay them a straight salary, 30,000 a year plus 5% of all your sales. That would be a mixed cost, whatever you're paying their wages in that period. That'd be another good example of that. There's also step costs where, say, for 100 to 300 level, 100 to 300 units, it'll cost us this much. From 300 to 600, it costs us this much. It just kind of keeps going up in steps. They can be narrow steps or wide steps. It's just kind of how they would look. Okay, different reasons for those. I want you to know that they're out there. It's important when you're doing managerial accounting that you can identify these costs and classify them as closely and accurately as possible in the real world, because when you're doing budgets and you're doing planning, okay, you're going to need to know what your variable costs are. You're gonna need to know what your fixed costs are. What of it is mixed, you know? If you want to cut as much cost as possible and be as competitive as possible, your estimates have to be as accurate as possible. And that's all for this chapter. The main thing I want you to take away from here is the cost behavior. Know what fixed costs are, know what variable costs are, know how they change with the levels of production. Okay, understand what mixed costs are. And as I said at the beginning, the remainder of the chapter covers different methods to estimate. It says fixed cost, but it should say mixed cost. We'll skip this part of the chapter and we'll move on to chapter 4. Well, we'll start talking about job costing.